Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today for this webinar on global IP management. I hope you'll find it interesting. This meeting is being hosted by Oxfirst. Those who don't know us, Oxfirst is an economic consultancy based in Oxford and in London, and we undertake economic assessments in the IP space for public policy purposes, for litigation purposes. We are damage experts, but we also work quite a bit on licensing. And we did a study last year, quite a comprehensive study on how to make the intellectual property system more accessible in low and mid-income countries. And we assessed in our research what companies could be doing to help and to pay their part and to assume their responsibility towards society to assure that partners break the equation of making innovation work for people around the world. And when I kept bouncing around these ideas, I found a lot of response and reaction from Novartis, and especially from Ian Hiscock and from Corey Salzberg, who really, for whom what I was trying to help people understand in terms of how we need to revisit the TRIPS trap. It had meaning to them, and they had a lot of ideas of what can be done about the question. And so I invited both of them to webinar today to discuss this issue. So Ian Hiscock is the global head of IP litigation and transactions. He's based in Basel. And Corey Salzberg is based in Washington, D.C., and he's the vice president and global head of intellectual property affairs, both for Novartis. And what I hope we could get out of this webinar here today is to discuss ideas and suggestions in terms of practical approaches and operational approaches to make the patent system work also in low and mid-income countries. I understand Novartis has started a comprehensive program where they're making their patents around oncology available in low and mid-income countries. And they have formed a collaboration with the Cancer Society to make this tech transfer also work in practice. So not just paying lip service and giving the rubbish patents which no one wants in a patent pool that should supposed to save the planet, but in reality it's just window dressing. But it's quite an operational, practical project with hopefully soon some tangible results. But I think I have spoken enough, so I'd like to pass on now the floor to Corey and to Ian to present their work in the context of the big challenge that we face as society in bringing in developing countries to the patent system.
Sure. Well, I can jump in first, Roy. Thanks very much, first of all, for having us. These are really important conversations. And Novartis, I think, always believes that it's really important to be able to share our perspectives and share the work that we've done in the past, the work that we do now, and the work we hope to do in the future. Because often, I think we're always hearing from the critics who don't actually even give lip service to, or really, I think, even understand or take the time to know what we're doing. So we really appreciate it from that end. We are, as a business that, of course, every day takes financially practical, and also sustainable approaches to everything we do, including access. We think it's really important to kind of consider things from the reality and not just from an ideological perspective. So thank you for that opportunity. Mm-hmm. I think I have, just as an opening point, three key points that I want to kind of put on the table and then we can circle back around to as you wish. One is, and I kind of mentioned this already, you did a great job in introducing this topic and saying, how can we make medicines, in part using IP, more accessible? And I think that's the key word, because we often fall into this trap, I fear, and we see, of people assuming that there is no access to medicine. And I think it's really important to always start with who is getting medicines and what is working before we get to where are the gaps and who's not getting access to medicines. These conversations about access rarely start there. And just to give you some quick figures, Novartis, we just had this, by the way, our annual results yesterday, so we have the most up-to-date figures. Our core business, putting aside global health challenges and those special parts of our business, which we can maybe talk about later, reached 284 million patients in 130 countries just last year alone. So that is a lot of access just from the regular business. About 1.6 million of those are in LMICs. So that's, we're talking about our flagship products using the regular approaches, to business, 1.6 million patients. And you have to also understand that we're a company where a lot of our medicines are really for pretty rare diseases and for specialty type situations. So it's not like the kind of thing that every patient or common ailments that most people have. So that's actually a lot of access happening there. That's just one set of figures. About 20 billion treatments in 2023 alone were sent around the world. So we can talk more about that after, but the first point I wanted to make is when we talk about improving access, let's build on the access that happens, because I think it's important context that the business model per se actually works for most of the world. The question is, what do you do about those gaps where it doesn't work so well? Second key point I wanted to just put on the table, I kind of mentioned it already, these discussions about access to medicine almost invariably, in most circles tend to approach access with a religious like belief that IP is somehow a barrier and IP is at odds with access, when in fact, the evidence, many studies, and just common sense actually show the opposite, that IP actually facilitates access in most situations, both in the short term and the long term. And we can talk maybe a little later about some of the ways that happens, but that is a fact, and it's really, it's a fact that's hard to controvert. If you don't have IP, in those situations where we don't have it, you tend to not have access. And the third thing that I want to put on the table, which is related, is that when you wrongly position IP as a barrier to access, two things happen. One is you impede the ability to really look at IP as something that can help to facilitate access, which is a negative. And as we'll talk about, there are ways to use IP to really drive access, even in those situations where traditionally populations have a hard time being reached through a regular market-based IP system. But the other thing you do by villainizing IP is you ignore the real barriers to access that are affecting most of the LICs, LMICs, and even some of the UMICs, which are things like general poverty, lack of healthcare infrastructure, a lack of trained healthcare personnel, a lack of diagnostics capability, a shortage of healthcare workers, disease stigma, and a mistrust of healthcare services. These are all factors that, if you're going to rush to look for a scapegoat and blame IP, it usually means that people aren't working on strengthening the healthcare system, which is really kind of the key, along with some IP considerations, to actually get access to medicine. So sorry for the long introduction, but these are the key points. I've got lots of detail we can talk about later, but I don't want to monopolize the time at the beginning. Let me see if Ian, I'm sure Ian has some opening thoughts as well, but I'll turn it over to him.
Yes, thanks, Corey. Probably the only thing to add is that a lot of what our company does in many other ways to get products to patients, whether it's through patient assistance programs or other philanthropic mechanisms where we are actually giving product away either at cost or free in certain parts of the world, depending upon the treatment. And indeed, we'll possibly come to some of those examples in the future of this webinar. But what's nice here is that we are able also in this webinar to focus on how intellectual property and how patents in particular can be used to be leveraged in a way to facilitate access. So when we get to the example which Roya hinted at earlier on, it's to be seen not just as the only way that we can improve access to medicines. It's an additional mechanism, if you like, which uses the intellectual property in hopefully a fairly unique way, and we're looking forward to discussing that.
So Corey, you mentioned basically that this is not the case, that if you don't have a patent in a country, people will get access to the product. You're saying if there's no patent in the country, that's actually an indicator that the company has no commercial interest in the country, and they'll probably not be very active and engaged there. So basically, without the patent, there's a good chance the company may just be ignoring this country and not care at all.
Yeah, you want me to elaborate a little bit on that?
Absolutely.
Sure. So first, some facts, because I think, again, it's important context. I know you know this, Roya, but make sure your audience understands. In most of the poorest countries of the world where we're really concerned about access, there actually are no patents right now. That's for a variety of reasons. Number one, the TRIPS agreement actually does not require LDCs, as defined by the United Nations, to have patents. There's a waiver in place for pharmaceutical patents, I think, through 2033, and a more general waiver of other provisions, I think, till 2034. I may have those backwards, but it's a long time from now, and it's been extended 3 or 4 times. So the reality is that most of the poorest countries where we worry most about access do not have any IP in place, and yet they don't have access. So it shows you that, that there's an issue there that's not related to, certainly not related to IP being a barrier in those countries. The other fact is that most companies, including Novartis, do, and we can talk about the pros and cons of this later, but do not file or enforce patents in a much broader array of countries. So for Novartis, our standing policy, which has been in place for a year, I mean, I think over a decade, maybe even longer, we don't file patents. And if we have any that we got through acquisitions, we won't enforce them in LDCs. So that's how the UN system, the World Bank, in a slightly different way, but pretty much overlaps, defines countries' economic status based on LIC status, so low income, or LMIC, lower middle income, or UMIC, upper middle income. So taking the World Bank type classifications, we don't file or enforce in any LIC, the LDCs on the UN side, and in about 80% of the LMICs. So in addition to the TRIPS not applying, there are real, and most other companies, I should say, are pretty much on par with that. So we don't have IP in those markets. So that tells you something really interesting, which is, people who rush to blame IP for a lack of access aren't looking at whether there's even IP in place there. Now, flipping that around to your real question, my point that IP actually facilitates access, this is really just a practical consideration about how businesses work. So number one, the fact that there's no IP in place often will tell you that there's a broken market system, because we have to remember that IP is a market-based mechanism. It works. It's an economic tool, right? It's designed to give you a limited term of exclusivity in order so that you can have the whole market to kind of earn enough that it justifies the investment you put in the first place to invent new medicines. But if you don't have a functioning market, then the fact that you're having IP in place doesn't give you that money to be able to actually, make it worth your while. And at the so we look at IP systemically across the whole world in terms of our overall returns. But in market, the thing that most people, I think, don't recognize is that there are particular costs that companies need to incur to launch a medicine successfully within a given market. So it takes a substantial amount of effort and investment to, number one, get your regulatory approval, right? Go through the local system to actually have the local health authority assess the safety and efficacy of your product and approve it locally. Then you need to have the infrastructure in place to get your medicine out. So that's everything from distributors in place to actual physical infrastructure, whether it's refrigeration or electricity, or delivery mechanisms to get, or the existence of pharmacies to begin with in rural areas of many countries. All of that has to be in place, and often will differ medicine to medicine depending on what type of medicine it is and what type of conditions it needs to have in order to actually get to patients. Another factor is being able to have, and this is a key one that people I think very often overlook, and I can give you some real life anecdotes from our company. People often say, why don't you have, for example, we have an amazing product called Zolgensma, which is a gene therapy for spinal muscular atrophy that affects infants. And we often get the critique, why aren't you launching your gene therapy in the developing world? Well, one reason is that this disease, spinal muscular atrophy, has to be diagnosed. And if you're not diagnosed within the first, I think, 6 months of being born, then this drug doesn't work. And even in the United States, when we launched this product, most states in the US didn't have comprehensive programs to actually screen for SMA, spinal muscular atrophy. So that's just one example of how, and that's a very sophisticated drug, but even for much more common diseases in poor countries, we often don't even have the diagnosis or even the hospitals and the doctors around in most of those countries to diagnose the disease in the first place. And another factor, is making sure that you actually have healthcare professionals that are trained in the existence of a medicine, educated about it, and educated how to use it. To build all of those things takes investment, almost always from the pharmaceutical innovator themselves. So if there's no incentive or market mechanism, such as a patent, and this is, I know this sounds like I was talking about something else, but I'm going to link them together now. If there's no market incentive for you to come in and invest in building all of those healthcare infrastructure components, then you're not going to have an opportunity, a viable financial opportunity, a sustainable one to actually launch your medicine. And that is why IP helps to actually persuade and enable companies to make those investments on the innovator side. And what we also find, and by the way, there's research about this, several studies, which I can send your way if you're interested. I won't go into the citations and everything now, but I can tell you there are many that look at this. And the flip side of this is that generic companies, if there's no innovator to pave the way, they don't have the means or the desire usually from a market perspective, because their businesses too, to do that work. So in other words, when you don't have any innovator launching, often because you don't have patents, you also don't tend to get the generics, because the generics also don't see the market opportunity, but also don't have the ability to fund all those other activities. So that is kind of maybe a little long-winded, but an explanation for why IP affirmatively drives access in the short term, even in poor countries in most situations, not all. I mean, some countries are so poor that it's not going to work. But why not having IP in place often can work against the interests of achieving access. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much. So what I gather really is that the patent system, because we're mainly talking about patents, really is part of a certain legal infrastructure that needs to be in place in order to bite. And with that legal infrastructure comes also a market infrastructure and a certain baseline position. And if that is not here, if there are no judges, there's no court in place that even has any background in IP, the patent office is insufficiently equipped, the baseline legal something is not here, no company would really go and start protecting patents there. So there's a certain level when the patent system just stops biting or having any grip. And I think if you look at the World Trade Organization and the TRIPS agreement, there's only so far it can go, because the TRIPS agreement offers exemptions and limitations to the patent system, but it has no answer to countries where there isn't even a baseline grip or infrastructure or architecture for patents to even get started. So you can only have a waiver or a safeguard if there's something here to be safeguarded. If that isn't here, then that's it, basically. So what can you do in such situations? We don't even have a global governance structure. We have a global governance structure on paper, which says, well, you can claim compulsory licensing regimes, but if there's no patents under which you could claim it, then what's the point? What can you do in such a situation, like in these really hardcore situations? Does the patent system stop there then? And can we just say, well, never mind, that will be in the future, let's just focus on the others? So what is there anything you can even do from a company perspective? Because you're also not the government.
That's a great segue. I'll just make two quick remarks and then turn it over to Ian, because it's a great segue to this example that we are trying to find creative ways to put the patent system to work to address those gaps. But you're absolutely right. I mean, when there's no local patent system, the only thing the TRIPS agreement does through the Doha Declaration is it creates this compulsory licensing exception under the paragraph 6 regime, as they call it, which basically allows countries that don't have capacity to manufacture on their own to turn to outside countries to try to help supply them. But of course, that still begs the question, what is the attractiveness of that, even to a generic, to take a compulsory license in let's say India, which of course has a lot of manufacturing capability for generics. Indian generic companies also have no market-based incentive to sell into very poor sub-Saharan African countries, for example, in many cases, because there's no market opportunity there. So what do you do about that? There's lots of different approaches, and I think it's really important to be broad in your context. It's not just the patent system that's a solution. One set of solutions, of course, is philanthropy, just getting funding, to offset the fact that there's no market mechanism. We see this in certain disease areas, right? I mean, there's the Gates Foundation, there's lots of others that just basically donate money to the cause. We at Novartis have particular programs for certain diseases, just to give some examples outside the patent system before I turn it to Ian to talk about the patent-based ones. But we have a drug called Coartem for malaria, which we've actually given 1.2 billion doses of this malaria drug to the developing world since 1999, I think. And that's all done at cost, so we don't make any money from it. It's philanthropy. Same for leprosy. I think we supply 100% of the world's leprosy medicines. About 7 million patients we've treated in the last decades for leprosy. So you can get to some of these gaps for certain diseases in a limited way through philanthropy. And those are great programs, but of course, they're not an answer, in the big picture for every disease, for every patient that needs it. So the other way to do it is to try to think creatively about how you can take the patent system that does exist and the patents that do exist in some countries, like India, to give an example, and then use it in a way to help try to create that incentive using leverage of other ways to make it more attractive for licensees to actually take that patent and supply other countries. We have a great example of that. Ian's the expert on that, so I'll turn it over to him maybe to talk about that example.
Thanks. And maybe just as a kind of an add-on to what you said, Corey, we've had as a company a policy publicly stated that we will license any patent in any country for the manufacturer, as Corey said, I think earlier, for the manufacture of the product for use and distribution in an LDC or an LIC. And yet no company has ever taken us up on that. And so, clearly, simply having patents in some countries and looking to make them available to people for manufacture and distribution into an LIC or an LDC, simply having that on its own doesn't get you where you need to be. So a few years ago now, we were approached by the Medicines Patent Pool, who were interested in seeing whether they could get access to one of our oncology products in order to replicate a lot of what they'd already started doing with the hepatitis drugs and HIV drugs. And there are a number of examples. If you go to the MPP website, you'll be able to see examples of those products that they have been able to work with originators to make their patents available for generics under a voluntary license scheme. But what became clear in the discussion with MPP was that oncology is a much more complicated disease area than hepatitis or HIV. And Corey's alluded to it earlier. There are numerous things that need to be put in place before you can actually get your products to the patients, including the infrastructure, the doctors, the nurses, the diagnostics, the supply distribution, and so on. And indeed also the follow-up care that's necessary, in particular for oncology patients. So MPP went away to scratch their heads, but Novartis also has a long-standing working relationship with the UICC, which is the Union for International Cancer Control, and we've been partnering with them for a long time on trying to raise awareness of the disease and how to address cancers as effectively as possible. And UICC is actually the initiative, which is the company, or the NGO rather, which is behind what is known now as the ATOM Coalition. ATOM is Access to Oncology Medicines, and the ATOM Coalition has brought together a whole raft of organizations from the public and the private sector. So this was set up in late 2020, in 2022. It combines pharmaceutical companies who are able to hopefully bring their products into the coalition. It combines diagnostics companies, and it works through MPP to try to find generic companies that will work with with MPP under a voluntary license scheme to make the products available. So how does it work? So what we have done is to identify one product first off, and we'll see how well the mechanism works, and if it can be proven to work well, then hopefully more products will follow. In fact, Novartis is the first to provide a targeted oncology product. The product is nilotinib, which treats chronic myelogenous leukemia. And we have patents in a number of countries, as Corey mentioned, where generic companies might want to manufacture the product. We have agreed with the MPP on a voluntary license to make the product available in a total of 44 countries, most of them LMICs or LICs. And of those 44, in fact, currently there are only 7 countries which still have patents for this product. Now, as Corey says, this is not untypical. A lot of the markets that are in the 44 are countries we would never file patent applications in anyway. So we have the voluntary license with MPP, and then through that, MPP are able to sub-license generic companies who will then commit to supply some or all of the 44 countries. So they get to supply not only the 7 where we still have patents, but also the 38 which do not have patents. I've got the maths wrong. 37 that do not have patents. So the reason why we think that this has a chance of success is because of the fact that the coalition actually is not just a means of licensing the patents, but is also a means of bringing together all of the necessary parties that are going to help to build that infrastructure in each of the countries where the product is going to be made available. And that is what is, I think, unique about this. I think it's certainly different to any of the models that have worked through MPP in the past. It certainly solves the problem that just sending a box of product to a country and hoping it's going to get into the patients is clearly not going to work. And so it's actually going to hopefully have also a long-term benefit for the country and for the patients in the country. So you might ask, well, how's it going to be funded? Well, the generic companies, in a way, have, one can call it a carrot in terms of accessing countries where we do see a significant commercial potential for the product. We have already built the marketplace. These are the countries where we have our patents in place. And so they're getting an early access to those countries without having to worry about patent issues from us. And in return, as I say, they are committing then to supply to the countries where there are no patents, and indeed where probably the patient need is greatest. There is a small royalty built into the sub-license between the generic company and MPP, and we've committed that royalty, any proceeds from that royalty should be returned back into the coalition, so that can then be used in addition to continue to fund the whole program and to continue to help build the infrastructure.
There may be a few people who may not be familiar with MPP. Could you maybe explain a little bit, just by background, what the Medicines Patent Pool is about? Just to make sure everyone is on the same page.
Yes, sure. I mean, the Medicines Patent Pool came about as a way to try to address a number of significant health needs, and I mentioned AIDS and hepatitis, through working with the originators, asking them to initially pool their drugs so that particularly when it came from the HIV crisis, there were a lot of overlapping intellectual property rights, and they were looking to make sure that patents were not going to be getting in the way of access for patients, and it's evolved quite considerably from, I think it's fair to say, from that initial how can we stop patents being a barrier to, in fact, how can we make sure that patents are being utilized as a means for facilitating getting the product licensed to generics through a voluntary licensing scheme, which is something which has, as I say, worked very well in some therapeutic areas, but is now looking, we're looking to expand it into the more tricky area of oncology.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
I don't know, Corey, if you want to add a bit as well.
Yeah, I just had two things. One is just for terminology purposes, because I think it's always good to educate, even for ourselves, because it can be confusing. I think Ian's correct as that it started as a real patent pool, and a patent pool is there exactly for, as Ian said, to make sure that the transactional costs of finding and getting a license to multiple different patents to create your own drug aren't prohibitive. But it really has evolved into something that really, despite its name, is no longer a patent pool. We'd probably call it more of a clearinghouse, where it's kind of a one-stop shop to get the rights you need to make a medicine, as opposed to different patent owners contributing and then taking licenses out. So it's a slightly different mechanism. Second point I'd make, which you hit on a little bit, but just to build on a little bit, one of the other big differences that we've noted between the diseases, and the reason why MPP was originally focused on HIV, I think tuberculosis, and then more recently hepatitis, is number one, because it involved large numbers of patients relative to different types of cancer. Obviously, cancer collectively has a lot of patients, but each type of cancer is much more rare than the number of patients with HIV and TB and hepatitis C, right? Which can be in the hundreds of millions, I think, for hepatitis C. So if you look at the market opportunity with that many patients, that's a different dynamic than some of these cancers, which are relatively rare. The other point is that those diseases, particularly HIV, given the history, have big institutions like Gates Foundation and many others that have funding sources. So they can help to finance and make it attractive for generics to take licenses through the MPP to help treat HIV patients. But for oncology, we don't historically have those types of foundations that are funding and financing oncology patients. So without those financing mechanisms, the MPP model becomes much trickier to just dump a bunch of cancer patents into that. That's why it's it doubly important, in addition to the all the infrastructure issues we talked about, to think creatively and to take a different approach, even though we are trying to build it into MPP with oncology. But it's not as simple as just saying, why don't you do that for all disease states, because the dynamics are very different.
Mm-hmm. So you're trying, I understand you're coming here from a situation where there was a lot of pressure on the pharmaceutical industry, where people said, you're the ones who are responsible that people die. You have the solution and you're not giving it away as cheaply as you possibly can. And the reason is the patent system. And out of that discourse, there was a certain obligation also from the pharma industry to start thinking creatively of what in addition they can offer. But there are a lot of people here from other sectors who have never experienced such pressure, and where there's no critical community that says the way you treat the patents is really, really bad. You should not be doing this. You make access to mobile phones more expensive or what have you. It has never happened, really. From your perspective, would you be able to share with IP managers from other sectors insights on how you made the patent system work in your context to do patents while doing good? Because it seems to me the oncology example is a very nice example where the global litigator of the company, whose really job is not primarily to make patents available to LMICs for sure, has taken some personal engagement and initiative to do something about it. So what would you advise IP managers from other sectors what they could be doing to assure patents break the equation of doing something good to society also primarily. What could they do?
Go first, Ian, and then I can.
I mean, I think it's a great question. I think as maybe just to give a little context to the importance of patents for the pharma sector. You know, we are in a fairly unusual situation that we have a business model which is expensive in terms of the development, and it takes 10, 15 years maybe to get a product approved and onto the market, and billions of dollars of investment and high risk, a huge amount of failure along the way, not because the system is inefficient, but that it is a highly regulated process to get products approved, requiring an awful lot of clinical studies. And yet, after all of that, we often have just a handful, maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 patent families of real importance, and probably only one patent family, the patent family which protects the active ingredient in your drug, which is of critical importance. And so we have a product which has very little patent protection in terms of the number of patents that they actually have. And Corey will cite all sorts of numbers because I know that it's his favorite topic. And the other thing about this business model is that it relies upon the fact that when the patent expires, the generic company is able and will make an exact copy of the product that you have invented. And it's that dependence upon the patent to really drive the business model that is the incentive for us to, as Corey set out at the beginning, to bring the product to market. And so I think to back to your question, then I think the problem is that patents work up to a point for us, but where we don't have patents, it's not our it's not that we would even if we had a patent in small countries necessarily need to be enforcing it, because the patent is the incentive for us to bring the product to the market there. And in most countries, the compound patents are respected by generic companies where the system is working well. And so I think that you don't need to necessarily take the IP from the pharma sector and say this is how it should be done in telecommunications, because there the model is entirely different. There you're going to need to have a lot more cross-licensing and access to the essential patents and so on.
But there we use the patent pools all the time, mainly because there's so many patents that read on a single product. But so far, I'm not aware of any patent pool that has bothered with helping access in LMICs, even though you have the most important pools in the world in this sector.
No, I think it's a fair point. I mean, to maybe connect both of those perspectives. Ian is right that the business models are very, and the way that different industries use patents are very different. In terms of what can other industries do, to maybe learn from or do something similar. Well, first of all, I think partly why they're not under the same pressures is because there is a belief, right or wrong, in the world, that medicines are different, right? I mean, I mean, I think many countries, they take healthcare as a human right. I mean, healthcare is a human right. That's part of the law. The question is, what does that mean, of course? And some countries interpret that to mean that the newest patented medicines, as soon as they're invented, everyone has a right to them. That's not, that's controversial, I'd say. I mean, there are different views on what it means for healthcare to be a human right. But I do think that medicines occupy, a different place in the worldview of what people ought to be entitled to compared to a smartphone, for example, even though one could argue that smartphones save many lives. And in fact, even in the field of medicine, the technology in a smartphone is critical to actually get medicines to people they're used all the time. But so putting all that aside, I do think there's more pressure. Well, there's more pressure on us than others. Maybe the best parallel would be something like food or water, or these kind of essentials. But so what can other industries learn if they want to, or if they are pressured to provide access? I think a few things. Really two main things. Number one, I think I'm assuming that in any other industry as well, you have to look holistically. IP itself is never going to be a solution to getting more product to people alone. You're going to have to look at what the different dynamics are that are driving the access problem to begin with, which probably are a little bit different than what we just described. And you're going to have to see how IP fits into that in order to, I think, use IP favorably to solve the problem. And I think the second, so that's lesson one. Lesson two, I'd say, is you need to be willing to be flexible to a certain extent with IP. So to be clear, we don't believe that IP should be flexible for most situations. As I mentioned at the beginning, and this is why I mentioned it, we, as one company alone, currently reach 284 million patients in the world in 130 different countries, which is a lot of the world, right? I mean, the majority of the world's countries, 130, because the IP system works as it should. So we, unlike I think some of the calls that we hear from some who are critical of the IP system, we don't believe that we should redo the IP system or impose compulsory licensing and flexibilities everywhere in every country, because patents don't work. That's not true. The data and the experience is clear that the system works incredibly well for most patients and in most of the world. The question is, what do you do where it doesn't work? And that's where the flexibility, I think, approaching IP flexibly comes in. I also think it's where, the debate and we would argue, maybe it's unfair in sometimes that the system gets criticized where people want to change the whole thing. We hear this a lot from activists that, they want to throw out the whole system. They want compulsory licensing to be an option just because the government doesn't like a price. We don't believe those are appropriate uses of flexibilities, but there are appropriate uses of being flexible in how you approach things, ideally voluntarily, because that works better, which maybe we can talk about after. But I think so that maybe, to summarize, is the other lesson, that, be willing to be flexible, but also practical about where those flexibilities make sense.
Mhm. There is a lot of talk about sustainability and the responsibility that companies are increasingly assuming in the international system. There's a certain recognition that governments and global governance institutions, such as the United Nations or the World Bank, they can only get that far, and then that's it, basically. This is then a metaphor for the private sector. And in that context, the discourse on public-private partnerships has emerged. We're talking increasingly about sustainability. We have the Global Compact that measures corporate social responsibility in companies. Surprisingly, that discourse has never entered really the world of intellectual property. It seems to stop. It seems to be, you do good generally speaking, but what you do with your legal rights, we don't really never got what is this esoteric area which nobody really, whatever you do with your stuff in IP. But if I were to stretch that overarching idea further, that we recognize more and more that corporations are assuming their responsibility in the world, what about then the IP? What is practically doable, and where does the responsibility of a company also stop? Because there's only so much you can do. What is your personal experience with this? Is a huge question, but I think it's a really important one to ask for. Where are we heading with IP? So in your personal experience and from what you've seen in your careers, what's your take on that?
So maybe just to jump in first, I'd say that we certainly believe still that governments have the primary responsibility for the healthcare of their citizens. That's not to say that corporations shouldn't act responsibly and try to do their part, but governments it's a fundamental role of governments to make sure their people are taken care of, and that priority issues like healthcare are given the priority that they deserve, and given due importance. We unfortunately see, a fair number of countries that don't seem to invest enough in their healthcare systems, and the economic realities of something like healthcare, as Ian mentioned, particularly pharmaceuticals. It is incredibly expensive and risky work to actually invent new pharmaceuticals, but also to actually get them just approved and distributed and successfully into patients' arms and bodies who need them in a given market. So really, I think that this is a long-winded way of saying that at most it's a partnership, right? I mean, the governments really need to be partners and need to be responsible at the end of the day for doing what they can. And then we, of course, are very willing, and I can speak from personal experience, right, to step up and try to find creative ways to work with them to bridge those gaps. I think one key that we've learned, we've talked about some of these examples today, but also, in all these bigger debates about, those who wish to break the IP system and get rid of it, that is, we feel, really the wrong approach. Really collaborative approaches, again, in partnership, public-private partnership, are the effective way to do things for a variety of reasons. Number one, if you approach corporations as partners, then naturally they're much more willing to work with governments and do more to contribute. And I think a really important, it may sound really superficial, and I'm not speaking personally, but from a company perspective, I think it's critically important for the world to give credit when credit is due for the programs and contributions and steps that the private sector takes to try to help governments with their obligations to their people. What we often find, at least we feel, is that no matter what we do on access programs, no matter how many times we try something like this ATOM consortium, we get very little compliments or very little, call outs from particularly activist groups, but also the WHO and other organizations. They just don't give any credit. It's just always criticism and always saying that's not enough. What about this? What about that? And I think it goes a long way to just say, this is a great program. Thank you. Can we find out how do we expand it? How do we do more of it? I really think that's a big missing gap, a big gap in helping companies do more. The other important point about the collaborative approach is that when you have something like voluntary licensing, it actually encourages, as opposed to compulsory licensing, for example, which is what some people propose to help address access. It really encourages companies to do more than just share a patent. Because as we've discussed extensively today, simply sharing a patent is not going to create access in most of these places where we're most worried about access, because it's not about the patent. It's about all the other pieces. But also, even just in the IP world, as we've learned from the COVID situation, it's not just about the patent there either. It's about things like sharing know-how, teaching scientists or training personnel in other countries who may be in an earlier phase of their technological abilities, how to do things. All of that comes from voluntary collaborations and partnerships. It does not come from forcing a patent owner to part with their patent. So I think, for me, the inspirational lesson is the more collaborative we are, the more, kind of support and praise you get for doing these things, the more corporations tend to be willing to increase the programs that they're doing. And that's what we're trying to do with ATOM. That's why it's a consortium, right? It's not a forced mechanism, and it's an experiment. But to me, these are some of the lessons that I think we can apply going forward. Ian, I'm sure you have some thoughts too.
What Roya's comments made me think about is that there are also various indices that measure how good we are with our intellectual property, and rather strangely, we are criticized for having patents in too many countries, and yet we're also then criticized for not licensing patents to make our inventions available in the countries where we've already been criticized for having patents. So you can't win either way sometimes. I don't, Corey, you might want to embellish that a bit.
No, it's true. I mean, we get I mean, several of these indices, but also just in general discourse about IP and access to medicine, people, I think, mistakenly assume that there are patents in the poorest countries. And if you dare file a patent, for example, in LDC, to Ian's point, you get criticized, for impeding access by filing the patent in that country. Never mind the fact that our experience, I will say anecdotally, we have been our experience with the African patent systems, OAPI, and what Ian can remind me what the other one is, ARIPO. They want us to file patents there, but the pressures are against it, so we don't file there. But we get criticized if we do file. But then we get told, why don't you do more voluntary licensing? And to Ian's point, well, if you haven't filed a patent in those countries, there's no patent there to license. So we can't create those local partnerships through IP if we don't have the IP in the first place. What we can do, as Ian discussed in the Atom example, is try to take the patents that exist outside of those markets, such as in those countries where there may be more generic manufacturers, and try to use that as leverage to get them to supply the products into those markets that don't have the patent. But there does really seem to be a disconnect between the idea that, if you file a patent, that's bad, but if you don't license the patent that doesn't exist, that's bad too. And all of which is to say we need to get more understanding, I think, in education among those who criticize the IP system to understand how it all works, because you can't have it both ways.
So
and just a quick anecdote. A few years back, we had a request for a compulsory license for some of our products in a South American country. And we were a bit bemused because we didn't actually have any patents for the product in that country. I mean, we would have loved to have had some money from the generic if they wanted to pay us a license fee, but we didn't even have the patent.
I had one overarching thought here, which goes into the direction of awareness raising on intellectual property and making clear IP is sometimes internet protocol, otherwise it's the other thing. That if you look at the big discourse on terms of the responsibility of corporations in society, generally patents do not really feature in this discussion. I think that's a big gap. And if they feature, the only answer that is being offered is, but just don't do them. So it shows how extremely reduced we still are when we are thinking about doing good while doing business, which is a big question where there's a lot of time and energy spent on how can you do business and at the same time promote bigger social goals, bigger goals of public interest, etc. There's a gigantic amount of research and practical activity going on. To the best of my knowledge, that has never touched IP. And the few instruments we have in place have basically stated, well, just do not protect your patents. And then we have the solution, which just shows you how dreadfully reduced we still are in our mindset of IP management. So because we're coming to the end, what would you do to bash that and to say, like, in 3 practical terms, this is how you can do patents while doing good, and not just the overarching business, but on the patent side, do something or do whatever you do with your legalese stuff. And
Well, I guess I have
it.
No, I have a slightly different take on it. I agree with your sentiment. I guess what I'm not sure about, frankly, is whether patents behavior per se is something that should be measured as opposed to the outcomes. So one of my, Roy, you know this, we've had conversations offline, but one of my kind of pet peeves about many of these initiatives and these indices where you get graded for behavior, they tend to look at sometimes things like you said, where do you not file patents, and you'll get credit for that. What they don't look at enough is, are you achieving actual access, and how? And as long as you are, achieving actual access, meaning that, patients are getting your medicines or whatever other product in another industry, patients are getting your products and are able to benefit from them. As long as you're able to demonstrate through evidence that you are actually achieving that end goal, shouldn't you be credited, and shouldn't that be encouraged, regardless of how you got there? Sometimes maybe you got there by using your IP in a flexible way, like we're trying with the Atom Consortium, for an oncology product where otherwise access wouldn't happen. But the real measure there shouldn't be did you try to license your patent? It should be give it enough time, of course, but have you actually achieved the goal of creating that access? And in other situations, maybe IP is not the way to do it. So if you've achieved access through a philanthropic program in a different area, shouldn't you be getting the same credit for that? So I guess my point is, I agree with you with your sentiment, but maybe it needs to be viewed kind of holistically in terms of what are the various ways are you driving the end goal of ensuring that society benefits from what you produce for society.
Because patents are a means to an end, no matter what.
Correct.
Really. Also true. Okay, so there are a few questions. Sometimes patent protections are accused of blocking affordable medicines. Novartis has launched expensive medicines like CAR T and so on. How do you manage patent protection regarding expensive drugs in developing countries?
So I can start on that. So for one thing, as I mentioned earlier, and I gave the gene therapy example, in many of these countries, it's not about patents. The difficulty with access is getting the infrastructure. So the way a CAR T works, just to explain for those who don't know, I mean, this is it's a procedure. It's not really a drug. I mean, there's a drug involved in a sense, but you are taking an individual patient's T cells out of their body. You are re-engineering it in a way that has to be done in incredibly short time frames by attaching a kind of a new component to it to help the T cell identify cancer cells specific to that individual patient's body. And then you're re-injecting that re-engineered T cell back into the body to recognize and fight cancer going forward. That takes an incredible amount of infrastructure, right? The diagnostics, but also centers and facilities that can do it, and the manufacturing facilities that can do this really quickly. That is really the biggest barrier, I think, to getting that into patients' arms in other countries. And we're working on that, but it's really hard to do in most developing countries right now because of non-patent issues. Really quick on the pricing side, I think people need to also, whenever they think about pricing, need to remember that these is a very small number of patients that actually, for most of these kind of procedures. So you can't charge the same as you would for a pill, for an aspirin that treats, millions and millions of patients, the same as you charge for something that treats only a few hundred or a few thousand patients, because that would make it impossible to actually ever earn a return on what you invested in these in the first place. So that the economies of scale need to be considered too. Ian, I don't know if you have thoughts on that question. If I missed
Just an
anything.
addition on that point, that the CAR T therapies, the Zolgensma for treating SMA that you mentioned earlier, these are single treatments. It's a one-off treatment with long-term benefits for the patient. So you have to also measure the cost over the lifetime of the patient, who in the case of many of these treatments actually then becomes a fully contributing member of society, able to live a normal life, not have constant treatments from the hospitals, and ultimately become a wage earning, tax paying member of society.
There's one last question. And I apologize, I won't touch the developed country question because this was more about LMICs here, this webinar. So let's leave that for another debate. There's another anonymous question which says, well, maybe the drug costs are so high because of the burden of licensing fees that Novartis has to pay itself, or that others need to pay. How do you tackle such matters?
And you want to talk about FTO quickly and transactional costs?
Yeah, I mean, it is a fact, and it's not obviously unique to the pharma industry that when you have to take multiple licenses, you will get royalty stacking that adds to our cost of goods. I'm not quite sure if there's a simple solution to that, other than that we hope that the companies that we need to take licenses from are recognizing that if they make the demand's too high, then actually the product is not going to be so successful. It's either going to be too expensive for people, or alternatively, it might just become economically unviable. So I would advocate, and probably as a company that has patents which we need to license sometimes, you have to find the right balance there in terms of what you're asking for.
I think we are out of our time. From what I gather here is, don't blame the patent system. Do not think that no patents are the solution to assure the global public good. Rather, refine it and start thinking, what does the management of intellectual property mean? And how can you manage IP in the public interest? And there we have some practical example that you have engaged on, where you're trying to help make oncology technology available to LMICs. Not just the patents, not just a piece of paper, but help establish an entire infrastructure, an ecosystem around knowledge transfer and know-how and workforce that can handle these questions and so on. And and if that works, there would be an amazing blueprint for many other industries. And patent pools, in spite of the fact that there are many mostly used in the telecom and ICT space, have not come to grips yet with the idea of actually using the mechanism and instruments to assure access to IP and LMICs. And the medicines patent pool is more like a clearinghouse, not a typical patent pool, but has already helped a little bit. But you're going outside of that instrument and just work in another way with through a public-private partnership. So I really hope with this very short introduction, we have inspired those who listen today to start thinking also how they can manage their own intellectual property through a different lens. And I think the benefit for that is twofold. On the one hand side, we raise awareness on IP and on what IP can achieve to society, for society. And on the other hand side, obviously, most importantly, we are helping people all around the world in a borderless way benefit from technology. So thank you very much for being here today, for discussing this with us, and for taking the time to listen in. We have our next webinar in 2 weeks, I think on Valentine's Day, with the US Patent and Trademark Office, with the economists team that is looking at the role of patents in secondary markets and the role of patents as a financial instrument. Please join us for that as well. And we have our conference coming up, June 17 and 18 in Munich, the 9th IP and Competition Forum, where we will also talk about these aspects. So please feel free to get involved there as well. Anyone who's keen on doing a webinar, please get in touch. We're always looking for interesting speakers. That was it for the advertisement. Any last comments from Corey, Ian, or
Just
anything you'd
thank
still
you for
like to
having us.
say?
It's
No,
been a
thank
pleasure.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Good.
thanks indeed. It's our pleasure. And of course, this is just the beginning of an ongoing or a piece of an ongoing conversation, really important, complex issues, and we're happy to be part of it. So thank you.
Super. Well, have a lovely morning, afternoon. Enjoy the rest of the day. Bye-bye. Thank you very much again.
Bye.